From the Baker Institute for Public Policy, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ambassador David Satterfield. Baker Briefing tackles the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. Each episode is recorded in front of a live audience. Today's topic: challenges and opportunities facing Lebanon. It is a pleasure, Mark, having you here today. This discussion will be of great interest to those here in Houston, Texas, in our broader audience who are very interested in the future of Lebanon and whether there is a prospect for economic, social, and above all, political change there. You came to elected office as a parliamentarian in 2022. Those elections were in many ways, as were the elections earlier, a reaction against the failure of the established elites, the established political class in Lebanon to deal with the problems confronting the country, confronting it in an economic sense and a social sense, problems that had been building for many, many decades. And I recall very well February 14th, 2005, when Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri was assassinated, and the appearance of dramatic change which took place shortly thereafter. First, the March 8th pro-Syrian demonstrations, and then the extraordinary counter-demonstrations of March 14th, and then the withdrawal of Syrian forces. That was seen as a turning point for Lebanon, but that was 18 years ago. Mark, tell me how you see Lebanon today, its challenges, and what's required from Lebanese, and what's required from the international community.
First, thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have this conversation with someone who knows Lebanon so well. And I think Lebanon has continued to jump from one crisis to the other since it lost all balance with the civil war in 1975. And recuperating and rebuilding state institutions, maintaining stability has been a tough challenge, while at the same time being exposed to regional issues, being dragged to wars, also repetitive wars with Israel. I think Lebanon at this particular juncture is going through its worst times because there's a failure at the level of state institutions. There's, on the administrative side, there's failure at the political level amongst parties, and there is a major failure on the economic front. All of that has led to major social catastrophes. Currently, for people who don't keep up with the news, Lebanon has only 2 hours of electricity, massive shortages in medicine and running water and other services, and worst is lots of people's money has been lost in banks because we have a four-pronged bankruptcy. The state balance or the budget is broke, the central bank is broke, and state-owned institutions are broke. So it is one of the worst economic crises that hit any country in the past 150 years of modern day history. Lebanon has a lot to overcome, but it all draws back to the center, which is the political dynamic which is running the country. The decisions taken there have had repercussions and detrimental consequences on everything else. And those political policies that have been fundamental are basically the idea that the state can continue to serve different communities with independent policies, and two, the state in its entirety can live side by side with a militarized Hezbollah that has their own foreign policy and can take a decision to start a war anytime, and still till today is engaged in the Syrian war, fighting on the side of Bashar al-Assad. So all of these have had consequences on alienating Lebanon from the Arab states and the international community, failure repeatedly to enact reforms that are much needed since the end of the civil war in 1975. And it has allowed for a lack of accountability on all the issues that has faced the country, specifically the loss of money, the budget deficits, and worst of all is the 4th of August explosion that shattered a third of the capital Beirut by the nitrates that were wrongfully imported to the country, seems to benefit of the Syrian regime and others. So the current situation in Lebanon, I think for the Lebanese living in the country and who are leaving in droves, and the Lebanese abroad, is everyone's looking to see if this country can take a turn towards a more positive outcome. The situation as it is today continues to spiral out of control. The Lebanese lira is losing value every day, breaking a new record, and the shortages continue in several necessary items, petrol, diesel, and others. So I think the Lebanese population is looking for some serious reforms to happen, and therefore they have elected a reformist bloc, which I'm one of, that surprised everyone in grabbing 10% of parliament despite a very biased electoral law, despite heavily entrenched political parties with full control over government institutions, security apparatus, even their own militias, such as Hezbollah. Those changes have given hope that things might change in Lebanon, and there might be a consolidation of a different political effort to challenge the traditional parties that obviously have been on a track of constantly depleting their support and failure when it comes to governance.
I would note for our audience, the motto of your movement is all of them means all of them, in reference to those elites.
Exactly, because whether we like it or not, there has been a series of compromises among the traditional parties that no one can excuse themselves from the blame. And they always try to contest that that was the only possible option at the time. But I think it was more about maintaining the status quo and playing the game in the traditional rules that will not allow for the building of a country. So the compromises that were done after the civil war to coexist with weapons, Hezbollah's weapons in specific, to coexist with government corruption, to allow for a takeover by militias and armed men that turned into statespeople and undermined, they gutted state institutions that became at the service of that specific militia, depending on who was the reigning minister controlling a certain public service. This led to massive economic losses, a lot of corruption. And I think, again, to focus more on the turning points. Today, what's happening in Lebanon is causing a lot of stir, especially among the middle class, among the Lebanese diaspora, which is massive in the millions, that are always asking, and now they have interests that were taken from them. Their money that was saved in Lebanese banks. Lebanon has an economy of 60 billion, used to have 200 billion in their banks, because we receive 7 to 9 billion a year of expat remittances. Currently, the economy is 20 billion a year, and we still receive 9 billion in transfers from the Lebanese expats. Close to half of our income as a state is derived from those expats. So those are not only an economic power, those people are also becoming a political power, because they're determining local policies with their cousins, with their relatives. They're influencing political choices and voting choices, and they're influencing funding to institutions, to non-governmental organizations and others. So more and more, the political class, which used to depend on public services and control over state funds and allocating state positions in a clientelistic fashion, or directing state funds towards institutions that are politically aligned or controlled by those particular parties, even Hezbollah included, which was also became part of that function, that has been completely undermined when the government went broke. And the service provision, the old social contract between the traditional parties and their supporters, was impossible to maintain. And I think these are the opportunities that are allowing for a consideration of serious change in the consolidation of political opposition to the Killon Yani Killon, the old traditional parties, and is allowing for exploration and challenges not only on the parliamentary level, but on municipal levels, syndicates and unions, university elections. At every level, you see contestation of traditional parties that have been, since the Civil War, without competition.
Mark, a dominant analysis in the international community, not just in the United States, is that in a chaotic situation, such as at present, a crisis situation, that at the end of the game, the most organized, structured political force in Lebanon is Hezbollah, and that Hezbollah will emerge truly dominant. Tell me your analysis of the situation. Is this right? Is this wrong?
I think Hezbollah's power is derived from a premise that there is a state which is highly central and Hezbollah can dominate that state. If Hezbollah stands alone and tries to run the entire state, they cannot replace it. Given that Lebanon is a multi-sectarian, multi-ethnic country that runs on a consociational system without allies outside of their power base within the Shiite community, Hezbollah cannot exercise the same influence they have. And I think the landscape in Lebanon today is reflective not in the favor of Hezbollah, but on the contrary, it is undermining Hezbollah's ability to have a hold on power, especially when there are two dominant allies, the Amal movement and the Free Patriotic movement. During the past elections in 2022, have lost sizable support in their communities, have shrunk in size and influence, and both of them are heavily invested in state benefits being directed to their base, which are no longer there. Therefore, Hezbollah now not only has to fund its own, but it also has to extend its support to parties that are on its flanks to make sure that those people continue to survive. Even more junior partners like Slayman Franji or Talal Irslan or others all lost. Those allies are constantly becoming a bigger burden to sustain because they don't have legitimate representation within their communities of a certain size. So
you're describing evolutionary political change rather than a dramatic revolutionary event. Hezbollah can halt the latter, but it can't stop the evolution of the political structures of Lebanon. What should the international community be doing, both from a messaging standpoint and a substantive standpoint? You've seen some extraordinary developments over the course of the past 5 years. France, which traditionally, in the end, was willing to support Lebanon and the Lebanese political class, has said no. Fundamental economic reforms are absolutely required, the position of the international community as a whole. The Saudis, traditionally supportive of a chosen ally within the Sunni community, literally has turned its back and withdrawn its funding and political support. What needs to be done that isn't being done? What should be continued that is part of the international community's position?
I believe everyone, especially Lebanese politicians at the day, Rafiq al-Hariri in his day, always assumed he can coexist with Hezbollah. When the Madrid process reached a peace agreement, then transitioning away from Hezbollah becomes easy. That bet didn't work. And I think Michel Aoun and Walid Jumblat and others, when they did the quartet electoral alliance after 2005, also had a similar bet. Let's contain the situation because then we can transition. And then Michel Aoun said, I can't win them, let's join them and see how we can transition. In all those cases, Hezbollah has proven that it is an ideological party serving the interests of Iran, with little interest in reforming the state in Lebanon because it's allied with the most corrupt branches of that state or political parties, and continues to serve its own political interests at the expense of the well-functioning of the Lebanese state. And therefore, I think the international community, what they need to do is adopt a clear-cut policy in transitioning from any tolerance of lack of reform in Lebanon. They need to chop it, and we need to move completely to an agreement which allows for a reconstitution of executive power in Lebanon, that allows for the implementation of serious reforms, specifically judicial independence, as well decentralization of the administrative functions. The centralization of the state will always make it easier for Hezbollah or any centrally corrupt political party to be able to control everything that's happening across the state. So the more we decentralize, we allow for private-public partnerships, we invest more interests in the managing of the day-to-day affairs of the citizens, and we take that away from a central political center which basically decides on everything, it will be easier to contain corruption, contain Hezbollah, and allow people, citizens, to be able to practice accountability with those who are delivering those services closer to home.
So what you're saying is continue the tough love position that says without these implemented or implementing fundamental reforms, the international community will not again rescue Lebanon, coupled with pressure, with support for fundamental structural change in Lebanon. You're advocating here, and I don't disagree, but you're advocating here for the construction of a modern Lebanese state, not on the wreckage of a previous state model, but a quasi-feudal entity. Is it doable?
I believe it is doable now because the Lebanese have little resistance because of the crisis on the economic level, because of the stagnation of decision making, and the ability to literally spend years without electing a president or a functional government. And I think that necessity is overwhelmingly powerful to an extent that it is easier now. Add to that, a lot of those traditional parties are going through transition, either from dad to son, or the founder being old and frail, and they cannot pass on that legacy. Again, a reminder to the audience, those people established their loyalties through guns and civil wars, so people died for them. There's a bloodline that is linked to the sacrifices that the community did, so their claim is built on thousands of people who died fighting for a cause in the 80s. Their children and the people who will inherit them do not have the same loyalties. They do not have the same discipline and do not have the same claim on the ability to control that audience and tell them, this is where we need to go. So the people are looking more for their interests, and I think that is the Achilles heel that the international community at this particular time should put a lot of pressure on benefiting from it. And I think that was tested by the French when they tried after the explosion to talk sense with those in power, and they found that it's not going anywhere. This is, again, you use the phrase tough love. I'll take out love and just use tough, because it is much needed now and it can be done now. And I think the Lebanese overall have showed that by electing representatives outside of the club. They said they exist, they represent us, and thousands and hundreds of thousands came up and said, we're willing to change.
Lebanon has no president. It has a caretaker government which is not able to take any major decisions. It has a number of key administrative posts that very soon will come vacant, including the head of the central bank. All of this appears to outside observers as a situation that can't be sustained or sustain itself for long. You and I have seen Lebanon manage to sustain these kinds of vacancies for quite long periods. Is it different this time? Do you see all of the pressures that you've outlined coming together to generate over the course of, let's say, the coming year, outcomes that lead to reform, that lead not just to a false stability, but to a genuine new start?
I think there's still fight in the old regime. So the pressure will continue to build up. And I'm hoping that in the upcoming municipal elections that should happen in May 2023 would allow as well for a further undermining. So if you're building an alternative power structure, you've got your audience and you've got the few new parliamentarians, but you need to build the layers at university representative levels, syndicates and unions, as well as municipalities, as well as allies within the state functions. And I think that is exactly the competition which is happening with the traditional parties. Can they renew the deep state by their own choice and compromises? Or will they have to give in more space within the deep state for a different set of political actors that are stepping up and their ideas and their thoughts are making headway in governance and in policy? I think if again, that reformist push within the country finds a willing partner in the international community that is tough enough to say reforms should happen, that would hasten the rate of change within the deep state towards a more accountable set, which would allow for a gradual change. And I think the traditional parties, knowing their ability to maintain power, will then see that the status quo cannot be maintained. Therefore, they will shift and reform to continue to function within the state. Some of them have done it for tens of years, and I think they probably might do it again, but some of them might not. I think Hezbollah would be one of those who might be able to adapt, but will definitely be losing a lot of its allies.
Very good. Mark, thank you very much for being with us today. I wish you all best, you and your colleagues. There is an enormous reserve, despite everything, of American interest in, support for the idea which Lebanon was seen as representing. Whether true or not, completely or not, it seemed to be an example of coexistence in an area that lacked such a premise. And so a stable Lebanon on its own feet, able in all of its co-societal dimensions of living together, is still something important to see. So all best. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the team at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. This episode was produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Many thanks to the Baker Institute production intern who assisted with this episode, Maya Adekari. The Baker Institute for Public Policy provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based in Houston. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording on the campus of Rice University, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for listening.